The sea outside Truck Lagoon was still that night, black and endless, reflecting the faint starlight like a sheet of cold glass. On the deck of the world's largest battleship, Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone, hands clasped behind his back, the wind tugging gently at his cap. Behind him, the greatest fleet ever assembled by Japan slept beneath the Pacific moon. Hundreds of ships, each one a symbol of an empire at its zenith. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers stretched across the horizon like a floating city. To the officers and sailors below, it was the face of destiny. To Yamamoto, it was the sound of a ticking clock. He had always known this day would come. Years before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, before the rising sun was painted on the wings of the carrier's planes, Yamamoto had warned his superiors what a war with the United States would mean. He had seen America. He had walked its streets, studied at Harvard, visited its factories, and shaken hands with its admirals. He had looked into the heart of its industry and found something terrifying. Not its technology, but its capacity. The United States could build faster, produce more, and replace what was lost with machinery that never slept. He had tried to tell them. In the first 6 months of war, he had written, "I will run wild, and I will win victory upon victory. But if the war continues after that, I have no confidence in the final outcome." The politicians had smiled, the generals had nodded, and the emperor had remained silent. Japan's destiny, they said, was to rule the Pacific. To Yamamoto, it sounded less like destiny and more like suicide. And yet here he was, the architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of the combined fleet, the most famous admiral in Japan's history. He had drawn the sword he once hoped never to unsheath. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been his triumph, and his curse. It had delivered exactly what he had promised, a lightning victory that stunned the world. 6 carriers had struck from across the Pacific, annihilating the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor. Battleships burned, airfields lay in ruin, and the rising sun flag flew over half the Pacific within weeks. Singapore fell, the Philippines were dying, and the Imperial Navy was invincible. The newspapers called Yamamoto a genius. His portrait appeared beside the emperor's. But victory had brought him no peace. He knew what the world did not, that Japan had only awakened an enemy whose fury would come slowly, inevitably, like a tide. America had not surrendered. Its shipyards were already working around the clock. In the quiet of his cabin aboard Yamato, Yamamoto would study the intercepted reports. New carriers under construction in California, bombers rolling off the lines in Kansas, submarines leaving shipyards faster than his own navy could count them. For every Japanese victory, America replied with production. It was an enemy that fought with mathematics, not morale. So Yamamoto planned the only kind of war Japan could still win, one of decisive battles, fought quickly, before the tide turned. He called it Operation MI, a strike at the tiny island of Midway, far to the east of Japan's defensive perimeter. If he could lure the remnants of the American fleet into battle and destroy their carriers, perhaps, just perhaps, the United States would lose the will to continue. It was audacious, brilliant, and desperate. Inside the Yamato's flag bridge, the plan took form. Charts spread across the table like maps of the gods. Arrows and unit markers pointed eastward toward Midway. Yamamoto's staff buzzed with confidence. "Once Midway falls, Hawaii will be next," said one officer. "The Americans will have no choice but to negotiate," another smiled. "We will crush them like we did at Pearl Harbor." Yamamoto listened in silence. He admired their faith, even envied it, but deep inside he felt the unease that had haunted him since the day he became commander. He knew his officers believed in invincibility. He believed in probability. "A battle is not a gamble when the odds are known," he told his chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki. "At Midway, we gamble everything, because we know nothing." He studied the map one last time. The operation called for 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same strike force that had destroyed Pearl Harbor. They would approach Midway from the northwest and annihilate its defenses. When the Americans rushed to defend it, the main fleet, Yamamoto's own battleships, would move in from the west to crush them in a single, decisive blow. It was a trap designed to end the Pacific War in one battle. It was also the most complicated operation in the history of naval warfare. Multiple task forces would move across thousands of miles of ocean, coordinating by radio in a silence the Americans must never detect. Northern Diversionary Fleet would attack the Aleutian Islands to draw U.S. forces north. Timing was everything. Any delay, any broken message, any misstep could doom them all. Yamamoto knew this, and still he signed the order. "The operation will proceed," he said quietly. The officers saluted. The meeting ended. Yamamoto remained alone in the dim light of the chart room, staring at the red arrows crawling across the Pacific toward Midway. That night, as Yamato steamed eastward through the dark, he stood on the bridge again, listening to the low thunder of her engines. Around him stretched the vastness of the Pacific, his battlefield, his prison. Every ship in the fleet moved according to his will. Every man trusted his genius. Every success was his responsibility, and every failure would be his alone. He lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. The stars above were clear, the sea calm, the illusion of control complete. But somewhere far beyond the horizon, he imagined the Americans already rebuilding, already watching, already waiting. He thought of the cryptographers in Washington and Pearl Harbor, faceless men he could not see, and wondered if, at that very moment, they were reading his orders. For a fleeting second, he felt the chill of dread. He whispered to the wind, "If we fail at Midway, Japan will have no second chance." And then, with the weight of the empire on his shoulders, he turned from the sea and walked back into the light of his cabin, where maps, messages, and destiny awaited him. In late May 1942, the harbors of Japan thundered with engines and song. From Hashirajima to Yokosuka, the docks were alive with movement. Cranes swinging, sailors shouting, banners rippling in the wind. The combined fleet was preparing for its greatest operation in history, the assault on Midway Atoll. Every shipyard and coastal town echoed with pride. To the Japanese people, it was the beginning of the empire's final triumph, the victory that would break American resistance once and for all. But to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, standing on the bridge of his flagship Yamato, the spectacle felt hollow. He watched the shimmering horizon through his binoculars, his expression unreadable. The fleet that moved under his command, 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, heavy cruisers, and hundreds of aircraft, was the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. Yet in his heart, he felt only the weight of inevitability. The operation was flawless on paper, every movement timed to the hour. The first carrier striking force, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would attack Midway with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. A northern diversionary group would seize the Aleutian Islands, drawing the Americans away. Once Midway fell, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would rush to defend it. That was when Yamamoto's main body, waiting in the shadows with battleships and cruisers, would strike.
It would be Pearl Harbor reversed, an ambush that would erase America's naval power in one blow. Every officer in the fleet believed it would work. The pilots polished their flight goggles and joked about a second Pearl Harbor. Sailors wrote letters home promising quick victory and safe return. Even the newspapers in Tokyo were preparing celebratory headlines. "The Empire advances toward final victory," one read. But Yamamoto could not share their optimism. He had seen too much, known too much. The calm certainty of his subordinates felt like blindness. He had crafted this plan not out of arrogance, but desperation. Japan's resources were dwindling. The Empire's oil reserves, captured from the Dutch East Indies, would last barely 2 years. If America regained the initiative, Japan will be forced into a war of attrition, a war it could not win. This was it. Midway was the last gamble left to him. On May 26th, the massive armada began its departure. At dawn, the carriers slipped from their moorings one by one, their decks glinting in the rising sun. On the pier, families and dock workers waved, shouting prayers and farewell songs. The sound of military bands play in Kimigayo, the Emperor's anthem, carried over the water. The ship's horns answered in deep, solemn tones. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood proudly on the bridge. His pilots, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, were eager for another chance to prove their mastery of the skies. Below deck, mechanics prepared torpedoes and bombs, carefully aligning them for the first strike. To them, this operation was destiny fulfilled, the inevitable continuation of Japan's victories. To Yamamoto, it was something else entirely. He paced the bridge of Yamato, his mind far away. He thought of the odds, the distances, the uncertain weather. Most of all, he thought of the Americans, their resilience, their ingenuity, their factories. They are not beaten, he had told his staff weeks earlier. They are learning. His chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, tried to reassure him. "Our pilots are the best in the world, Admiral. Our carriers are superior. The enemy will be destroyed before they know we are near." Yamamoto gave no reply. He simply nodded and looked back at the sea. Thousands of miles away, in a small, windowless room beneath Pearl Harbor, a handful of American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo were reading the Japanese plan almost in real time. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had already cracked the JN-25 code. They knew the target, Midway, and the timing, early June. As Yamamoto's fleet sailed east in secrecy, the Americans were already preparing their trap. But Yamamoto didn't know that. His intelligence officers reported complete radio silence from the enemy. Reconnaissance indicated the U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, were still at Pearl Harbor. The deception was working, or so it seemed. The Japanese fleet moved in perfect order across the Pacific, the carriers slicing through the waves like knives. The weather was calm, the skies clear. Every day at dawn, the flight decks erupted in drills, fighters launching, bombers circling, crews practicing torpedo runs. It was a dance they had mastered long ago, perfected over years of conquest. To the men, it was routine. To Yamamoto, it was ritual, the preparation of a blade for the final cut. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the admiral would walk the deck of Yamato alone. Around him, the ocean stretched endlessly, beautiful and indifferent. Sometimes he would stop and stare at the sea's surface, as if searching for something just beneath it, perhaps a glimpse of his own doubt. He remembered his years in America, the laughter of students at Harvard, the clatter of machinery in Detroit, the vastness of the Mississippi River. He remembered how Americans talked openly, loudly, freely, a people incapable of silence. Yet that very openness hid something formidable: their unity when challenged, their ability to transform insult into industry. He thought of Pearl Harbor, the smoke, the flames, the sinking ships. He had given Japan its moment of triumph, but in doing so, he had sealed its fate. "I have awakened a sleeping giant, and filled him with a terrible resolve, he had written afterward. Now, as the fleet sailed toward Midway, that sleeping giant was stirring. By May 20th, the Japanese fleet had reached its launch positions north of Midway. The ocean was calm, the stars bright, the illusion of control complete. Messages from Nagumo's carriers arrived regularly. Fleet in position, weather favorable, pilots eager. Yamamoto read the reports, said nothing, and set them down. His officers saw only composure. Inside, he felt the slow tightening of fate. He looked over the map one last time. Every ship, every squadron, every arrow of movement depended on one assumption: that the Americans were unaware. But in his gut, Yamamoto had begun to feel a shadow, a whisper that perhaps, somewhere across the ocean, another admiral was already waiting. The operation was too perfect, too confident. War, he knew, was a gambler's game, and the more perfect the plan, the greater the disaster when it failed. He turned to his staff and said quietly, "Once we set this in motion, there will be no turning back." They nodded. He walked back to the bridge and looked over the dark sea. Hundreds of ships moved beneath him, their wakes glowing faintly under the moonlight. To his officers, it looked like power. To Yamamoto, it looked like destiny. As the fleet advanced, the radio operators began to pick up strange, faint signals, American transmissions somewhere to the east. The analysts dismissed them as routine patrols. Nagumo's staff sent back a confident report. No enemy fleet detected. Yamamoto said nothing. He only stared at the horizon and whispered to himself, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. Victory or death. It no longer matters. The dice are cast.
Dawn broke over the Pacific like a blade of gold, cutting through mist. From the bridge of Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo could see the blue horizon stretching forever, calm, peaceful, deceitful. His pilots were already at their stations, engines rumbling, wings folded like the talons of sleeping hawks. The morning air was thick with the smell of fuel and salt. The decks gleamed under the rising sun. It was, by all appearances, a perfect morning for victory. At 0430 hours, Nagumo gave the order: launch the first wave. Dozens of aircraft roared into the sky, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, heading straight for Midway Atoll, a tiny green speck in the vast blue ocean. Within minutes, the carriers were empty, their decks littered with fuel hoses and ordnance crates. On the flagship Yamato, hundreds of miles behind, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto listened to the faint radio chatter. Each message came through crisp and confident. "The enemy is surprised," one pilot reported. "Resistance light." Yamamoto nodded slightly. So far, everything was unfolding exactly as planned. But even as his staff celebrated, far beyond the Japanese horizon, American carrier planes were already in the air. The plan that Yamamoto believed secret had been read like an open book. U.S. cryptanalysts had cracked Japan's naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew exactly when and where Yamamoto would strike. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, had taken positions northeast of Midway. They waited in silence, their decks bristling with planes, their crews tense but ready. The hunter was walking into a trap he unknowingly set for himself. At 0600 hours, Nagumo received his first troubling message. The initial attack on Midway had failed to destroy the island's airfields. "Request permission for a second strike," the message read. Nagumo hesitated. He had to make a decision. His pilots were still armed with torpedoes, ready for an American fleet that, according to every report, was nowhere near. To launch a second wave against Midway, he would have to rearm his planes with bombs instead. He gave the order: rearm for a second attack. Below deck, crews scrambled to obey. The hangars of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hairyu became scenes of organized chaos, bombs being offloaded,
Torpedoes moved, fuel lines sneaking across the floor. The smell of gasoline and oil thickened the air. It was a dangerous process, one that required time and precision. Then, at 7:28 hours, everything changed. A Japanese reconnaissance plane, late to launch, its crew exhausted, reported sighting an enemy carrier force. The words hit Nagamo like a blow. He froze. American carriers? Here? That was impossible. Every calculation, every report had said the Americans were still at Pearl Harbor. But the message was clear. Enemy ships, possibly carriers, bearing 10 degrees east. Nagamo's heart sank. His aircraft were either away attacking Midway or being refitted below deck. Half his fighters were grounded. His decks were cluttered with fuel hoses and live ordnance. It was the worst possible moment to be discovered. He turned to his officers. "Recover the Midway strike force," he ordered. "Rearmed for ship attack, immediately." The decks erupted into motion again, men shouting, running, hauling bombs and torpedoes. The carriers became tinderboxes, their hangars filled with explosives and fuel. Nagamo looked skyward and saw only clear blue, no sign of the enemy. Perhaps, he told himself, they still had time. They didn't. At 9:20 hours, lookouts shouted the alarm. "Enemy aircraft approaching!" The first American torpedo bombers, obsolete TBD Devastators from Hornet and Enterprise, appeared on the horizon, flying low over the waves. They were slow, clumsy, and brave beyond measure. The Japanese CAP, Combat Air Patrol, dived to meet them, Zeros slicing through the sky like silver knives. The torpedo planes pressed on through fire and fury, releasing their weapons at suicidal range. Not one hit its target. Nearly every American plane was shot down. But their sacrifice had drawn the Japanese fighters away from the fleet, high above, far from the carriers below. At 10:20 hours, as the last of the torpedo planes crashed into the sea, a new sound filled the sky, the scream of American dive bombers. From 20,000 feet above, dauntless bombers from the USS Enterprise and Yorktown plunged almost vertically toward the carriers below. Their dive brakes howled through the wind, the sun behind them blinding the Japanese lookouts. In seconds, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were engulfed in fire. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes. On Kaga, a single bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar below, where torpedoes and fuel tanks were waiting. The explosion tore the ship apart. Flames roared from bow to stern, igniting aircraft, fuel, and men alike. Soryu was struck moments later, her decks turning into a furnace. On Akagi, the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack, one perfectly placed bomb hit the center of the flight deck. Fire raced down the elevator shaft, igniting torpedoes stacked below. Admiral Nagamo stood frozen on the bridge as the deck buckled beneath his feet. "Abandon ship," someone screamed. He did not move. His dream of invincibility was dying before his eyes. Hundreds of miles away, aboard Yamamoto, the first reports began to arrive. Enemy dive bombers attacking carriers. Then, Akagi and Kaga hit. Minutes later, Soryu aflame. Yamamoto felt the blood drain from his face. The officers around him murmured in disbelief. He ordered a messenger to confirm the reports. The reply came quickly. "Sir, they are sinking." The room fell silent. No one spoke. Yamamoto removed his cap, placed it on the table, and stared at the floor. "How many?" he asked quietly. "All 3, Admiral, possibly 4. He closed his eyes. "Then it is over." By sunset, only Hiryu remained operational. She launched 2 desperate counterattacks, managing to cripple Yorktown before American planes found her and set her ablaze. As darkness fell, her crew gathered on deck, singing the Imperial Navy anthem before abandoning ship. One by one, the 4 proud carriers of the First Air Fleet, the same that had struck Pearl Harbor, slipped beneath the Pacific waves. Back aboard Yamamoto, Yamamoto stood by the window of his cabin, staring into the night.
The sea was calm, indifferent, endless. The reports kept coming, each one worse than the last. Thousands of men lost, air groups annihilated, the elite of Japan's navy gone. He whispered to himself, "The war is lost, though the world will take years for it to learn it." In that moment, the admiral who had unleashed the Pacific War understood the truth no one else dared to speak. The Empire's greatest victory, Pearl Harbor, had come full circle. Its architects were now its victims. The hunter had become the hunted.
The Pacific was burning. From horizon to horizon, the black smoke of dying ships rose into the pale dawn like funeral banners. The once proud Japanese First Air Fleet was gone, reduced to twisted metal and drifting oil fires. The sea that had carried Japan's ambition now carried its dead. Aboard the super battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood motionless on the flag bridge, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where the flames still flickered faintly. The reports were no longer coming in bursts of coded chatter. They had become a slow, merciless tolling of loss. Akagi scuttled, Kaga sunk, Soryu gone, Hiryu aflame. 3,000 men lost, 4 carriers, the heart of Japan's striking power, erased in a single day. He had not moved in hours. The night had passed into dawn without his notice. Around him, the officers of the combined fleet waited for orders. None came. They spoke in whispers, afraid to disturb the silence that hung like a shroud over the bridge. At last, Yamamoto turned. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "Signal all units. Withdraw west. The operation is terminated." The words fell like a verdict. No one dared to argue. The Imperial Navy had never known retreat. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor, its fleets had swept across the Pacific unchecked. Singapore, Java, the Philippines, the Indian Ocean. Victory had been its natural language. But now, the admiral who had written its greatest triumph was ordering it home in defeat. The Yamato's engines rumbled to life, turning the great ship slowly westward. Across the ocean, the scattered remnants of the fleet followed, their decks blackened, their crews silent. Survivors from the carriers were being pulled from the sea, men burned, blinded, or floating lifelessly among the wreckage. The proud airmen of the Imperial Navy, once the envy of the world, were gone. Yamamoto did not look away. He watched the sea until the last flame faded beyond the horizon. Hours later, in his private cabin, he sat at his desk beneath the Imperial flag. The room was quiet, except for the soft creak of the ship and the ticking of a clock. Before him lay a blank sheet of paper, the after-action report for Tokyo. He stared at it for a long time before picking up his pen. He could not write the truth. The emperor would receive a report that spoke of partial success and severe enemy resistance. The official communiqué would claim that Japan had inflicted heavy damage on the American fleet. But Yamamoto knew better. He knew what no one in Tokyo yet understood, that the balance of the Pacific had shifted forever. He wrote a single line before stopping. The operation failed to achieve complete success. He stared at the words, the ink slowly drying, and felt the crushing weight of what they meant. In the wardroom, his officers debated. Some urged him to continue the fight, to send the battleships east and engage the Americans directly. "Our big guns still outmatch them," one said. "We can restore the Empire's honor." Yamamoto shook his head. "Honor does not win wars. Oil does. Steel does. Men do. And we have lost them all." He rose slowly and walked to the map table. The Pacific lay spread out before him, vast and blue,
dotted with tiny islands that suddenly seemed impossibly far away. "We have awakened a monster," he said quietly, tracing the map with his finger. "Its factories will drown us in steel. Its shipyards will birth more carriers than we can ever destroy, and we will fight until the last spark of Japan is gone." The officers fell silent. None dared to reply. That night, Yamamoto steamed west under a clouded sky. The stars were gone, the ocean black. From time to time, signals flashed across the horizon. Rescue operations, scattered escorts, fragments of a fleet that had once ruled the Pacific. Yamamoto stood alone on deck, the wind tearing at his coat. The air smelled of oil and death. He thought of the men who had followed him, the pilots who had laughed as they launched at dawn, believing themselves invincible. He thought of Nagumo, whose carriers now lay broken beneath the waves. He thought of the emperor, waiting in Tokyo for news that would never come. He whispered into the wind, "Forgive me." By June 6th, the last radio contact from the carrier group ceased. Hiryu had been scuttled, her crew lost. American patrols still hunted the stragglers, but the Japanese fleet was gone, retreating in silence through waters that had once been theirs. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff awaited news. When Yamamoto's message arrived, it was brief and bloodless. 4 carriers damaged or lost, enemy resistance heavy. Our forces have withdrawn to regroup. The bureaucrats blinked, confused. Withdrawn, one asked? The admiral must mean repositioned. They could not imagine defeat. The newspapers continued to print stories of victory. Only a handful of officers in the upper command understood the truth, and they did not speak it aloud. On Yamamoto, the admiral wrote in his private diary, "The tide has turned. The gods have left us." That evening, he attended a short memorial service for the dead. The crew assembled on deck, caps in hand, as the chaplain read prayers into the wind. The bodies that could be recovered, wrapped in flags, were committed to the sea. Each one vanished silently beneath the surface, swallowed by the same ocean they had once ruled. When the ceremony ended, Yamamoto remained alone. The sun was setting, casting a crimson glow over the western sky. It looked, he thought, like blood spreading across water. He turned to his chief of staff. "We will never again see the rising sun as it was," he said. "From now on, it will only set." That night, Yamamoto steamed west under a clouded sky. The stars were gone, the ocean black. In the admiral's cabin, the lights burned late. He sat at his desk, staring at a photograph of his family, a wife, 2 sons, a daughter. He had not seen them in years. He wondered if they would ever know what he knew now, that Japan's war had ended, not in surrender, but in certainty. The end had begun at Midway, even if the Empire refused to see it. He picked up his pen and wrote one final note to be sealed in his private papers. "If I am to die in this war, it will not be as a victor, but as a man who foresaw defeat and could not prevent it. I have led brave men to their deaths. May history judge them kindly." Then he folded the note, blew out the lamp, and let the ship's motion rock him into uneasy sleep. Outside, the Pacific rolled on, calm, endless, eternal. Japan's greatest admiral was sailing home in silence, his fleet broken, his faith gone, his war already lost.
The year after Midway passed not with victory parades, but with silence. The rising sun still flew from Tokyo to Rabaul, yet beneath the surface of that empire, cracks had begun to spread. Japan's war machine, once unstoppable, now strained under the weight of its own ambition. Oil grew scarce. Convoys vanished under the sea. Airfields were bombed before they could launch their planes.
and everywhere men whispered the same name, Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, wore his defeat like a hidden wound. In public, he remained composed, the very image of naval discipline, the sharp uniform, the calm voice, the steady gaze that had once inspired a nation. In private, he was quieter now, slower to speak, his nights sleepless. He visited shrines for the dead, wrote letters to the families of fallen officers, and read reports that told him, line by line, how the war was slipping away. He had known this would happen. Midway had not merely been a lost battle, it had been the moment the Pacific changed owners. America's shipyards were flooding the ocean with new carriers, new destroyers, new bombers. Each week, Yamamoto scouts reported more. "The Americans have built more carriers in 1 year than we have built in 10, one report read. He folded the paper and said only, "So it begins." The tide had turned. By early 1943, Japan's position was desperate. The empire still stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands, but its lifelines were unraveling. The war in Guadalcanal had ended in retreat. The Americans were advancing through the jungles, island by island, their strength growing like a storm. Yamamoto, though weary, refused to show despair. He visited forward bases, inspecting air units, shaking hands with young pilots barely out of training. He spoke to them with quiet dignity. "You must fight not for victory, but for duty. Even a single drop of your blood buys time for Japan to breathe." To the men, he was still a legend, the man who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had challenged the United States and lived to tell of it. They did not see the fatigue in his eyes, the resignation in his smile. Yamamoto had already accepted what others refused to believe. Japan had lost the war in the very moment it had seemed to win it. On the morning of April 14, 1943, Yamamoto received word that morale among frontline air crews in the Solomon Islands was collapsing. Determined to show his presence, he announced an inspection tour of forward bases on Bougainville and Bougainville. His staff objected. It was too dangerous, they said. Allied aircraft prowled the skies, and his itinerary, sent in clear code for coordination, was no secret. But Yamamoto waved off their concerns. "If I am to die, let it be on the battlefield." His schedule was precise to the minute, typical of the man who demanded order in chaos. On April 18th, he would depart Rabaul at 0600 hours in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, accompanied by an escort of 60 fighters to arrive at Bougainville by 0800. The message was transmitted to all relevant commands down to the exact route and time. Somewhere in the Pacific ether, American codebreakers were listening. In a small room at Pearl Harbor's Station Hypo, the same intelligence network that had handed Nimitz victory at Midway intercepted Yamamoto's travel plan. The details were so exact that Admiral Chester Nimitz at first doubted it was genuine. But Commander Joseph Rochefort confirmed, "It's real. He's going to Bougainville. We can reach him." The operation was codenamed Vengeance. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters flying from Guadalcanal would intercept Yamamoto's bomber at the exact moment it approached Bougainville. It would be the longest-range fighter interception in history. At dawn on April 18, 1943, the mission took off. Meanwhile, aboard the Betty bomber, Yamamoto sat near the window reading a book of naval poetry. He looked out over the islands below, green jungles, blue lagoons, flashes of white surf, and thought of the sea that had defined his life. He had spent decades mastering it, commanding fleets that had once stretched from Tokyo to Hawaii. Now he was flying over the wreckage of that dream. At 9:34 hours, as his aircraft approached Bougainville, his aide, Rear Admiral Ugaki, glanced out the window and saw glints of silver in the distance. "Enemy fighters," he shouted. A moment later, the American P-38s dove out of the sun. The escorting Zeros turned to meet them, but the Lightnings were faster, diving hard, guns blazing.
The first burst of machine gun fire struck Yamamoto's Betty across the right wing. The engines caught fire instantly. The plane rolled, trailing smoke. Inside, Yamamoto remained calm, hands resting on his lap. The pilot tried to level out, but the aircraft was doomed. It clipped the trees and disintegrated in a burst of flame deep in the jungle. He was dead before the wreckage hit the ground. 3 days later, Japanese search teams found the crash site. The Betty lay torn open among the palms, its fuselage scorched but largely intact. Yamamoto's body was still seated upright, his white gloves folded neatly in his lap, his sword by his side. He had died as he had lived, silent, disciplined, and at peace with fate. The news struck Japan like a thunderclap. The government announced his death as a glorious martyrdom. State funerals were held. The emperor himself wept. But within the Navy, grief carried the weight of prophecy. With him, one officer said, dies the last man who could have saved Japan. His ashes were returned to Tokyo. Crowds lined the streets for miles, bowing as the urn passed. His funeral procession moved through a city already dimmed by air raid drills, as if the nation itself knew the darkness ahead. In the years that followed, the empire he had served collapsed. Completely. Cities burned. The navy that had once ruled the Pacific was reduced to rusted hulks and wrecked dreams. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, it did so under the same silence Yamamoto had known on that long retreat from Midway. The admiral had been right all along. Decades later, when historians examined his papers, they found a line written in his own hand shortly before his death. In my life, I have seen the rising and setting of many suns. The one we serve burns brightest when it falls. He had seen it fall at Midway, though his nation had not yet understood. Today, the Pacific still holds the wrecks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lying in silence beneath miles of water. Near Bougainville, the jungle has reclaimed the bones of his final flight, but in that quiet, the ghost of Yamamoto remains, a man who foresaw the truth too late, who fought with honor in a war he knew could not be won, and who carried the weight of an empire's illusion until the very end. For the world, Midway was a turning point. For Yamamoto, it was the moment he realized that the empire he served had already lost the war.